have you joining us for this panel discussion convened by Poppies. Tracy from Buckinghamshire, hello, and to everybody else. So I'm Sophie Carabine, and I was the founder of the Corp project a few years ago, and we started an inquiry, and it's such a pleasure to be doing a gentle inquiry this evening with you. And our question was, how can we lay our bodies to rest so that they help the living and the earth? And we opened up the question of the options now and the options in the future to deal with our bodies. And in the course of that inquiry, which I led with Richard, who's on the call, and others, I met Poppy from Poppies. And I had a most wonderful visit to her business, which she has continued to develop. And it is thanks to Poppies that we're convened this evening. And I want to say that whatever your likely preferences are for what you do with your body after death, and who knows what they might be, that's for you and for the business that you run. But let me say this, if you visited Poppies and you were in the room where the bodies lay for the people whom Poppies was entrusted to look after, and if you were in that room with Poppy, you would know that she was simply letting those bodies be still and do, in a sense, what they wanted to do with the love and care of family and her. And she wasn't directing something, she was letting those bodies have the time and the space to go through the process that they were going to go through. And it wasn't about taking over or controlling it or dictating to anybody. And it was done with great dignity. And I want to say that that sense of how we deal with the bodies after death, whatever the method we chose, that has stayed with me. And it seems to be much better that perhaps if we do puncture the myths from the past gently, and then we enter with vigor into the conversation about what we might do in the future. And that's what we're going to do this evening. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. We're then going to spend the bulk of our hour taking your questions and dealing with those as openly and succinctly and helpfully as we can. And then just before 8, we will wind up with any other comments from the panelists. I want to thank Sarah Bax is on the panel, and Sarah is behind the Poppy sign, and Sarah's going to help us technically and with the questions as well. So welcome again, one and all, and without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, please. So I'm going to go first, if I may, to Ken West, who's absolute inspiration to many of us in the UK and globally. Ken, please tell us of yourself and your leadership and where you are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I worked for over 45 years in bereavement services from 1961. And on my 15th birthday, I became a horticultural trainee at Shrewsbury Cemetery. I was part of the new chemical craze of using grass growth retarders and herbicides, which destroyed the environment, and we later learned, of course, were harmful to humans. I moved on to be a cemetery sexton, managing funerals, and then to be a cremator operator at the new crematorium at Shrewsbury. And in the 1960s, of course, cremation was seen as progressive and the way forward. I moved into the management of cemeteries and crematoria at Shrewsbury, Sheffield, Wolverhampton, Carlisle, Cardiff, and before retirement at Croydon, where I also introduced reclaimed graves. In 1993 at Carlisle, I opened the world's first natural burial site, calling it a return to nature. And it was also, of course, a sustainable burial option. In 1995, I wrote the Charter for the Bereaved. This led to providing eco-coffins, the reusable coffin, and a wool burial shroud. And the Charter included conservation in cemeteries, particularly with the objective of the return of owls. Over my lifetime, I gained RHS horticultural certificates, the Parks and ICCM diplomas, and the Diploma in Management Studies. I was awarded the MBE by the Queen for services to burial and cremation, and an honorary MA by Durham University for my work on the individual burial of stillbirths. After retirement in 2006, I wrote 2 books on funerals, RIP Off, or The British Way of Death, and A Guide to Natural Burial. Anne and I have been fortunate to be together for over 50 years, and we now live in the wonderful Peak District.
Ken, thank you so much. That is an extraordinary life, succinctly summarised for us, and we'll come back and explore your current thinking because I know you're still very active. Thank you so much. I'm going to go now to Sarah Bax, if I may. Sarah is an intrinsic part of Poppies, and Poppies, I know, is looking in a very integrated way about what it means to be a green business, and I know you're helping to lead that, Sarah. So please tell us a little more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And I'd like to say what a real honour it is to sit on this panel with all of you. And we have been long-term admirers of your work, Ken and Katrina. You know, I know you've been a long-term friend of Poppy and Poppies, and we are super excited to be exploring plans together to bring Recompose to the UK. So that's something we're absolutely thrilled to be working on. And I'm a client support advisor here at Poppies, which means I'm usually one of the first points of contact that people encounter when they call Poppies with any questions whatsoever. That's one of the most privileged parts of my job. I also co-organise our simple cremation service for families who choose a very simple funeral. And as you said, Sophie, I'm leading our journey to become accredited as a B Corp. It's incredibly challenging, absolutely thrilling, and something I'm so proud that we're doing as a company.
Sarah, thank you so much. Just for people who are not familiar, imagine that you're running a business and you want it to be accredited as a green company. You might have investors, funders, customers who want to know that you're green. And one of the most rigorous ways of doing that is to go for B Corp. So have a look at it, because it isn't just about, you know, what do you do about your electricity and your gas? It's also what do you do about your people, what do you do about your whole supply chain and your overall approach to your social responsibility. It's not for the faint-hearted, I know that. So we look forward to following your journey on that. Thank you, Sarah. I know Sarah's in the office near the cemetery, and someone's just got locked himself into the cemetery, and she's had to just deal with him. So that's all part of the holistic service of Poppies, isn't it? I'm glad you're...
Absolutely. I've just had the most wonderful tap on the window that got increasingly panicked. Somebody is locked inside, so I will go and find them later on and let them out. But it's a good place to be. It's very peaceful.
Lesson 1, everybody on the call, you can be very interested in death and take it very seriously. But you know what that does? It makes you live life even more immediately, so that when somebody's locked in the cemetery, that's all part of it. And at 8 o'clock, I've got to go to a talk about hedgehogs in my local area, you know, and that is how it is. We're right here, we're in the death discussion, and we're living. We have the extraordinary experience of being on this planet. With that, I'm going to pass to Katrina, the CEO of Recompose, once known as the Urban Death Project. Many years ago, Katrina, I was rotating a fox carcass in a tin barrel with wood chip. I like to think that somehow that circulation of the fox in that little barrel somehow span across the water, and you kind of transferred it into something rather more plausible and useful. So many congratulations, and please do introduce yourself.
Thank you. And I'll echo Sarah and say it's really such an honor to be here today. And say to Ken, if I heard you right, a wool burial shroud, that sounds so cozy. I think that's the move right there. So but it's really lovely to be here. So thank you. I am the founder and CEO of Recompose. We are a benefit corporation, long story, but related to B Corp, which is based in Seattle, Washington. And almost a decade ago, I started thinking about cremation and burial and natural burial and what would I want for my body when I died. And I knew I didn't want cremation, and I knew I didn't want conventional burial. And a friend of mine, and I knew I loved the idea of natural burial, but I also love living in cities. And a friend of mine called me on the phone and said, Katrina, did you know that farmers in the US have been composting livestock for a long, long time? And it was one of those epiphanies, my light bulb. And I thought, if you can compost a cow, you can probably compost a human. That was, like I said, almost 10 years ago. And since then, we've legalized that process of human composting in 3 states in the US and counting. And we're operating here now in Washington State and soon to be operating in Colorado. So it's been a great journey. I'm thrilled to be talking with y'all about it, and I think that's a good start.
That is a wonderful start. Thank you so much. So I think we'll thread straight into a question because it comes from that, Katrina. I'm going to send it towards Sarah Bax and then it'll pop back to you, Katrina, but from Hannah Hunt. Let's go to Sarah first though. I'm a practicing funeral director and ex-research biologist in sustainability. I've been working with Howard Pickard, Resumation UK, and Brendan Day, Secretary of FBCA, it's one of the industry bodies here in the UK, on certain projects relating to sustainability within the funeral industry. What are the initial steps we would need to take to get recomposition introduced to the UK? So could we have a Poppies perspective first, because I know you're exploring, and then could I revert to Katrina from your experience?
Sure. So we're at a really, really early stage of looking into this. And as I understand, there's a lot of legal things to get through first and to understand where this sits within the legal framework of how we dispose essentially of bodies here in the UK. I actually don't have much more to add to that at the moment that is particularly helpful, but yeah, just to reiterate, we are super early stage and perhaps Katrina can offer a bit more light on that than I can.
Lovely, thank you, Sarah.
I'll give it a try.
Yeah, Katrina.
First, just for the audience, recomposition is one of the phrases that's used to describe, or to one of the things we call human composting. So like a little bit like alkaline hydrolysis, there's a number of phrases that describe the same thing. So if you hear recomposition, that's what it means. And just to give a little more definition around human composting, what we've legalized here in the US is very much the same concept that's happening on the forest floor as dead organic material breaks down and creates new soil. But it's a lot more controlled and refined than that process. I should say controlled. It's very similar to the process and it's more controlled, and it happens inside what we call a vessel. And so that's in a lot of times when we're describing recomposition to people who are thinking about legalization, we talk about it as a cousin to cremation, weirdly enough, because it's the body is placed into a vessel, the retort for cremation and our vessel for recomposition. And then after a period of time, it's transformed and something else is given back to families. On the one hand, ashes, on the other hand, soil or compost. And so even though it's much more aligned with and related to natural burial in terms of its return to the earth, from a policy standpoint, it's often a little bit more understandable to think of it in terms of cremation. It's a process by which we break the body down. That didn't really answer the policy question, but I think it's helpful.
It's a very helpful description of actually what happens and where it sits in the family, if you like. Okay, here's an immediate question that will be in people's heads. Does composting a body really deal with the bones?
Indeed, it does. One of the things that's amazing about the composting of this sort is that the type of microbial community that's at work is very high heat. And so the breakdown of everything happens quite quickly. Like cremation, Recompose uses some mechanical assistance to break down the larger bone fragments. So it's although I should say human composting would eventually break everything down, depending on the company or the organization doing the work, a shorter time frame often makes more sense. And also I think for families who are grieving, a shorter time frame can be beneficial. So in terms of our ability to give back that soil to families, takes us about 6 to 8 weeks to break everything down, including the bones.
Katrina, I'm going to ask you one more question about the practicalities, and then we'll go elsewhere and circle back. So some people, when they have ashes from cremation, which, as you say, families often like to have something changed, but of the person. Sometimes people talk about putting it on flowers, but of course it's been dealt with at a high temperature and it's quite inert, and the nutrients, such as they were, are reduced and locked up, and it isn't really a feed anymore. Nevertheless, I mean, some people think they might put it on their gardens and on their vegetable patches because they have this idea that it might go back to the gardener and the garden. What do you think are the cultural and other issues about human compost being used to generate food? Because that might seem a very good way of changing, looping around the circle, especially in urban environments where people might be growing food. What are the issues for you in the States?
Yeah, it's tempting to go full cycle, right? But I think the reality is there's so much, at least I'll just stick with the US, which I know best. In the US, we have plenty of land that needs our attention, that needs nutrients and biomass that isn't food crops. So we focus very much on that land in terms of the regeneration with the soil work and compost we're creating. So Recompose's official line is that you shouldn't use it on food crops. That said, from a biological standpoint, all of the work we've done with our pilot and the regulations that have been created around this process are to ensure safety and making sure that the pathogen levels are below any threshold that would harm anybody. So it's kind of a look. I think it's distracting a little bit from the public discourse if we start talking about growing food with this compost, and that for me is enough reason not to do it, because I think that the value, the carbon sequestration, the returning to the earth, the value is so high. We want this out there, and if we start talking about food, it just gets us distracted from the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know that nutrient deprivation and loss of soil structure, soil health, there's no end of places where the regeneration of soil will be valued. So it's not as if we're short of sites in theory, in any case. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions. Do keep your questions coming through. And then we'll look to the future of burial. Katrina, this is from Dana. Is the process with all the technical details trademarked, or is this available for assessing and suggesting to lawmakers in the rest of the world?
Well, you can't patent the idea of composting a human. So Recompose has several competitors who are starting to figure out their own vessel system. I have the benefit of having worked on it for many years now in terms of creating our system and perfecting it. And that system, pieces and parts of Recompose system is patented. But the reality is that there are lots of ways to compost a human. And so there are others out there doing it. And we do want to, like a lot of the information is out there in terms of livestock composting. It's not in any way a trademarked secret.
Thanks, Katrina. Final one for you for now. I'm assuming that in the same way that implants and certainly pacemakers are taken out of bodies before cremation, what do you do about metal splints from broken shin bones of footballers' bodies? What do you do about those?
I don't think we've had a footballer yet, but I would like that very much. So all of you out there, we do screen for non-organics after the process is complete. And actually, just like cremation, we recycle those pieces, and there's companies that come and pick it up from us to recycle those pieces and parts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ken, a question for you from Mary. My question is very practical. I have been diagnosed with terminal cancer, so I'm very likely to die in the next couple of years. I'm pretty much decided that I want to be buried in our local cemetery, which is very accessible to my family to visit. What is the most eco-friendly coffin I could use? I'm assuming that this is a better option than cremation, and I don't have time to wait for the law to change to allow the recomposition option. Thank you, Mary, for your question, and we all wish you the very best, I'm sure. Ken, coffins.
Coffins. Well, there's such a wide choice out there that they really go from wicker right through to many materials that are brought in from abroad, like bamboo and whatever. The very basic one, of course, is cardboard. And even pure wood from sustainable forests is still good. And that's used, of course, by the Jewish community. So I think it's a matter of negotiating with different funeral directors to find out what choice she has, and then to use the coffins that they can give her the best recommendation on. Quite difficult, because you're often reliant on commercial blurb with regard to the environmental qualities of these coffins. So one needs to be just a little careful on that.
Mm. Ken, I'm not sure if this is a question for you, it might be other people in the audience, but my understanding is that cardboard coffins, burying a body with carbon around it or composting with carbon works very well because of the breakdown that happens. But cardboard coffins in cremators have not been very popular with the colleagues in the crematoria because it creates a lot of, when you burn cardboard, there's quite a lot of sort of flaky ash from that. I don't know if you know any more about that. Just interesting for people making choices if they were going for cremation and a certain kind of coffin.
Yes, I can agree with that. The cardboard can be a nuisance because it breaks down into charcoal, a form of charcoal, and then spreads around in the cremator. Nonetheless, I've seen many of those coffins cremated and they do go through all right. But obviously, a wicker is a better option, or some kind of pure wood from sustainable forests, deal, a very light sort of pine kind of wood. They all work really well. And of course, that wood adds a lot of thermal heat into the cremator as well. So it can restrict the amount of gas being used.
Thanks, Ken. Could I perhaps also just here pay a real respect to the Muslim community for the way in which they have a tradition that they honour and which is very egalitarian, and it is burial and it is within 24 hours and everybody's buried in the same way. And all those traditions that use shrouds and not coffins, and how honest and open that is as well. So there are so many different traditions to learn from as well. Alex Coventry, thank you for this. Working within a larger funeral provider, we struggle to move fast on some of the larger ways to make funerals more environmentally sustainable. What smaller things can we do to make a difference in the short term? Thank you for that, Alex. I don't know whether, Sarah, do you come across in your business, ways of making those differences, the small differences that add up? Could you share any of those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's as much about informing your clients and customers as to the choices they can make that may be small but will make a big difference. So one consideration, I think it's been mentioned before, but is about travel to a crematorium or a burial ground, to really consider how you're going to get there, and whether you can carpool or take public transport, or whether there are options that you are happy with that are closer to home to sort of restrict the amount of travel needed to a funeral. That can be quite a simple way of thinking about a more ecological approach to a funeral. Others include decisions made about flowers, for example. We know that flowers are so popular at funerals. To think about help families decide whether they need, or whether having imported flowers is a really critical part of the funeral, or if flowers are essential, are there flowers grown locally or even in your back garden or your local community garden that you can use to place on the coffin? Do you need flowers at all? Flowers are often sort of more traditional arrangements of flowers are often presented in plastic oases, wrapped in cellophane. These are things that we don't need and provide a lot of waste. We've had some wonderful funerals since I've been at Poppies, where families have chosen to adorn a coffin with really personal items instead of flowers. For example, we held a funeral earlier this year for a chef. We had his chef's hat, his chef's whites on top of the coffin, and it was so personal. And there's no carbon footprint there because they came from home. Similarly, thinking of urns for ashes, if it's going to be a cremation, do you need to purchase another urn, or can you use something that you've got at home? We had one family who used a biscuit tin. The lady who died, her favourite thing was a shortbread biscuit or something similar, and so the ashes went into I think a pillowcase, popped into the biscuit tin. So these are small ways of helping families to think about what they what is not negotiable in terms of what they need for the funeral, but small things that can really make a difference.
Yeah, wonderful. And in keeping with the person. Yeah, thank you. I should say that with the Corpse project, I learned so much. And one of the surprising things was that the travel distance, the travel of the mourners, was probably the single biggest likely carbon cost. But it's really important not to be, you know, as you're saying, Sarah, you know, we've got to make decisions in the real world. So, for example, what if you very much wanted to be buried in a very well managed and wonderful natural burial ground, but you know, the car journey was the only way to get there? Well, then you've got to somehow add up the good that say someone's bought a field which is then not ever going to be used for intensive agriculture in a bad sense, it's never going to go for housing. What you're doing is you are contributing to the restoration, protection of that site, and the ecosystems and the soil and the natural resources. That is all wonderful. Against that, on one day, people have got to drive there. But hold on, don't we often go and visit our relatives up the M1 because it's important to go and see them, or whatever? We're not purists the rest of the time, most of us. And therefore, you know, I think we need to cut ourselves a little bit of slack sometimes, but try to see it in the whole. Thanks, Sarah, for that. The actual mechanics of cremation, composting, liquid hydrolysis, where bodies are again encased and then they are dissolved in liquid lime. None of this, it has to be said, is particularly pretty, is it? And I think we should be honest about that. It's not a pretty business. But there's a question here from Caroline. I think it's to you, Katrina. It's just, what sort of building does the composting happen in? Could you describe the plant?
Sure. I decided long ago that it was very important to Recompose, to the Urban Death Project before that, to focus not only on a new disposition option, which is, that is important. It has carbon savings. It means we can return to the earth, in addition to natural burial, be another way to do so. And if we ignored completely the idea of ceremony and ritual, I felt like we would be doing a disservice. Here in the US, cremation is now the most popular choice. And I think it's very common for folks to say, like, don't make a fuss, don't do anything. And I just think, just like visiting your relatives, right? It's a moment that really matters. And so that is to say that we've always thought about the place where people come to be composted to also be a place where families and friends could come and visit. And first of all, satisfy their curiosity about this new concept, and also to spend time with their nearest and dearest, and have a ceremony, like a service. So then, as we were opening with these grand ideas in mind, COVID hit, perhaps you recall, and so we did a bunch of changing things up. And so in the Seattle area, we opened a much smaller facility that, in fact, wasn't able to host friends and family at that time, partly because COVID didn't allow it. And what we found, so just to say, we started doing Zoom services, and that was this very strange silver lining for us to understand, like, that when being in person is so important, also you can do a lot with a virtual service. And so it's now been this extra layer for us of learning that you might decide to fly across the country to come to Seattle, or across the world, but you also might log in on Zoom and have a service that way. And neither is right, and both have benefits. And you're right, let's all cut ourselves a little bit of slack here. I totally agree. And but now we're opening a larger facility in Seattle where we will be able to host people, which we're really excited about doing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Katrina. Ken, I'd like to come back to you now. And clearly there's quite a lot of energy around the new ideas, the new solutions. But there's innovation going on in burial as well, isn't there? And there are opportunities, I think, in existing cemeteries and elsewhere. Can you tell us a bit about how you see natural burial going forward from here, and possibly sort of reinventing itself a little bit? I don't know.
I think an important consideration in what we're saying at the moment is that many natural burial sites take a coach. They're able to take a coach so that cars are not taken. And a tremendous number of natural burial participants will immediately say, I'm doing the burial today, but I won't be back. Now, that is never said with conventional burial or cremation. And they understand the carbon problems of driving there all the time. So they're much more open on that. And many people have said, this is it. He asked me to bury his body in natural burial and then leave him there and let him rest at peace. So we need to bear that in mind, I think. Yes, the one innovation is that in Croydon we could do recycled graves. Because there are London powers allowing that. That basically means we take a grave with some space in it, we take over the ownership of the grave, advertise that we're doing that and give the family the option of keeping it, but nobody did. And we then do further burials in the spaces in that grave for, say, a 50 or 75-year period. When we started it, the press gave us terrible publicity, triple-decker graves and all this sort of thing, but people took to it immediately. And in Mitcham Road Cemetery in Croydon, it's the only option people have. And I'm told now that nobody bats an eyelid when they go in there and they're told they're having a recycled grave. And there are about 400 of those burials, I believe, recycled over various periods. And they have, of course, tens of thousands of graves to use.
And am I right, Ken? You'll correct me, but surely there are countries where it's been the norm that a family leases a grave, perhaps for 40 or 50 years. And then it's understood that after that, the remains will be lifted and boxed, if you like, and it's expected that the family would take them, or I've seen them stacked up because families aren't that interested. And isn't it true, perhaps in Germany, I've heard that actually families are irritated sometimes when they're asked to take responsibility for longer. So is there not a big cultural, are we not back again to the cultural norms thing here about what our expectations are?
Yes, the biggest mistake we made in this country was to go for perpetuity burial. And that was totally opposed to the completely recyclable churchyard, which has existed for 1,000 years. They've been reburying in churchyards for all of that time and nobody ever thought about it. But yes, you're right. I went to Austria a few years ago, in Switzerland. They removed the bones from the grave after 30 or 40 years. They put them in an ossuary under the church or a big concrete chamber somewhere, and then they do burials. And I believe they even have members of the family come in and say, well, I know it's a little early, but can you remove grandma's body because granddad needs to go in? Completely different concept to what we would have here.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask the panel for their thoughts? I mean, let's imagine in the future we're going to have it's a market, isn't it? Different options for different people. We haven't got anyone on the panel who's particularly working on liquid cremation at the moment, but this is for those of you who aren't so familiar. I mean, rather like what Katrina said about composting of animals having happened, for a long time. It's also been, in fact, even with humans, that we have sometimes dealt with bodies that have been donated to science, where specifically, back to Ken's point, the family and the person said, we don't want the body. They didn't want the body to be an object to be dealt with, want to give it away and then not have to deal with it. And it has been the case that bodies and animals have been dealt with through lime and liquid lime particularly. And this system, it has the merits of using much less energy and much less risk to air quality than conventional cremation. It works with mains electricity. I've just taken gas out of my house and I've just using renewable electricity. Simple system, not particularly clever, but step in the right direction. It's a little bit like that. The downside of it is that the human remains are not, they go nowhere near Katrina's benefit of going back into the earth. But nevertheless, you think about Tooting, you think about London, you think about the numbers of people who might want a simple solution that's better than, in their eyes, than conventional cremation. I'd love the views of the panel on that. And I would love to start, if I may, with Katrina on that. Well,
if in my dream in let's see, 30 years, we have natural burial, recomposition, and then absolutely some water cremation, if you will, for some people who want that. I think there should be a few options. I hope there's more actually by then. I think there might be. But someone asked, I noticed in the chat as it popped up, is Recompose or human composting expected to take over cremation or burial? And I think the answer is probably fire cremation. I think what I've seen over the years is people choosing fire cremation as a default, not because they love flame, and not because, certainly for some it's embedded in their culture and their religion, and that I'll sort of like put aside as a really great reason for using fire cremation. But for folks who are choosing it as a default, I think the question is, why can't we present them with something better? And if we can, then I could see that going away by and large.
Thanks, Katrina. Let's, Ken, your view on liquid hydrolysis or liquid cremation.
I think the problem with these default options, as Katrina would say, is that nobody points out that cremation is a violent, dirty process, and that in fact all of these options are much better, simply because cremation is so bad. It releases all the body and the carbon immediately. There can be no future for cremation. Now, resumation, the one problem I have with it is that nobody's coming to me and giving me factual data on the actual energy usage. They keep saying it uses less energy than cremation, but where are those figures coming from? And so I would like to see much more data. Secondly, I worry really about water quality in this country. So releasing fats and anything down into the water system really bothers me. And I'd need to know that that's been looked at carefully and that there is no danger of fat balls and other things being created in the sewage system, which has been talked about. As long as that is covered factually, then I'd be quite happy with it. I think it would fit into the default options that Katrina mentions.
Is it a better generation of default options, potentially, depending on satisfaction on those things? Thank you so much. Can I go to a question from Matt? It's one for Katrina. I'm studying for a Master's in Architecture and Urban Design at Cambridge, UK, Cambridge, Massachusetts, we don't know. I'm interested in how an urban cemetery could present itself if anchored around the recomposition process. Do you have any thoughts or examples of how important the location of the resulting compost is? One appeal of burial in cemeteries is the visible location of the headstone, which always comes up in conversations about recomposition. Thanks, Matt.
I love that question. It's multi-layered. First of all, I'm not a person who needs or has championed the idea of the permanent memorial. But that said, anyone can create a permanent memorial if they want to, with pretty much any option, I would say. So I think I'm kind of punting that question, but Recompose has never focused on the idea of the permanent memorial, so much so that when we offer a conservation trust partnership option to our clients, it's not about placing your soil on a particular tree even. It's about having that soil go back to the forest. And so the difference between the tree versus the forest is really kind of where we are, where we're going and where we are acting currently. We've had so far composted around 70 people in our Seattle facility, and I believe about half of them have taken that compost home and used it on their gardens or to plant new trees. I've heard a lot of stories of planting trees, so that's great. When they donate it to our conservation trust partner, it goes to be used on all sorts of projects on 700 acres of forest land that has been degraded over the years. And it might be used to repair a riparian area or spread on meadows. We don't even track it once it's there. And so, but that's by design. I think I answered most of the question.
You did. I'd just like to frame some of these answers in another way, just for sharing some learning from the Corpse project. Before I did the Corpse project, I hadn't really thought about it like this, but you can absolutely separate out what you want to do about ritual, what you want to do about the body itself, and what you want to do about visiting and remembering the person afterwards. And we've kind of traditionally, we've looped all that together. So we've had a service with the body there. We've put the body somewhere, conventionally burial, and we've then visited and sort of remembered the person in burial. But I mean, remember the great traditions, the Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist traditions, where there is the idea is to release the body through fire, with all the disadvantages that Ken's put, but it's a very clean, open, and it's almost saying to the mourners as well as the person, let go, be free, go. And there is no sense of trying to be able to track that body back and visit afterwards. And then think of those people. I mean, my family might be, if they followed my wishes, it might be that what actually happens to my body is a small affair, the final moment when my body goes somewhere. But the memorial, the saying what they want to say about me, I'm going to shut my ears, that will happen somewhere else. And then I am relaxed personally about, I don't really expect a visitation to my body as such. So it's quite helpful, I think, to start to open up these things a bit, but all the time being sensitive that some people are returners, they want to go and see, and other people are not. And yeah, we're deeply affected by our own traditions and then our own radicalism in relation to our traditions, I guess. Let's take a question from Australia. We've got about another 8 or 10 minutes of questions. Hello from Australia. The ideas of a purist approach is interesting to me. Natural burial is in its infancy here, says Rebecca, and I have traveled to many countries and researched how it works. The differences between what is acceptable in some grounds and not in others can be vast. Ken, where do you personally draw the line between honouring someone's wishes and keeping the integrity of what goes into the ground? What about the times when what people really want might not be thought to be acceptable, or what is acceptable is not what that person might.
I think that's a very valuable question. And generally, when working in bereavement services, you did not want to be prescriptive. This is what we were trying to throw out. And then suddenly when you go to natural burial, you're having to say, it will be an eco coffin, there will not be embalming, and I don't want you putting non-native species on the grave. I'm sorry, but there has to be no alternative. You can't give way on that. And if people feel very strongly about that, you're effectively damaging the ecology. And I know that if we manage natural burial the way I'm talking of, very quickly the site is full of hedgehogs, it will have squirrels, it will have owls, voles, and all the insect life. And so there's no way of really getting away from that. The same with flowers. We don't want the litter of cellophane and plastic bags. And generally, I think people do follow with that. Once in a while, some people object to it, and often I think you have to accept that that goes on. And most people are pretty tolerant on it. But I do think that with natural burial, you have to be prescriptive. You have to make it quite clear that ecology comes first, the burial of the body comes second, and the two have got to fit together as best they can.
Thank you, Ken. My dear mother, her last days, she was ready to go, and she was lying very still, and she was holding her soft toy lemur. She had a lovely lemur, a very soulful lemur with big eyes, who just stayed with her after my father died. And we wanted lemur to be on the coffin at the funeral, but then we wanted to take lemur and keep lemur in the family. And the funeral director, who was lovely otherwise, realized how attached she was to lemur and put lemur in the coffin with her. And lemur, who was all polyester and goodness knows what, I'm afraid is in the natural burial ground. It's probably the only thing that is still visible. But it was just too late. But yeah, no lemurs, I agree. And I miss lemur as well as my mum, to be fair. I'd like to invite, if anybody is on the call who would say they were mainstream funeral directors or coffin manufacturers, welcome. And if you would be willing, we have a question about, how do you see this transition, and what are the barriers for you and the challenges? If anyone's there and is able to answer Mark Binnersley's question, that would be wonderful. There's a question about whether human composting or alkaline hydrolysis are legal in the UK. Often it's not exactly that things are illegal, but they are subject to local planning decisions, bylaws and all sorts. And it takes a bit of courage for the first initiation to be tested in that way. I think that's probably the answer to that at this time. Is the liquid cremation that Sophie mentioned the same as aquamation? Oh gosh, I haven't heard of aquamation. Would that be the same? Yes. Is that a North American term, Katrina? Do you have aquamation?
Might be. I've certainly heard it. Aquamation, resumation. There's a few more.
Yeah. So
water cremation.
It makes absolute sense. Aqua being water. Thank you from Malin in Sweden. For your information, in Sweden, the first body is buried deep. After 25 years or more, another body can be buried on top. 3 layers is possible. No parts of the body are removed, but then most people are cremated in Sweden. That sounds like in England, that would be a rather posh family crypt, I think. I think family crypts used to be like that, but most of us probably don't have that now. Thank you for that. Can we just touch on costs for all this? There's been, over the years, quite a lot about the costs of cremation and burial. Is the cost to the family more or less for human composting than cremation, Katrina? Do you know the answer to that?
I can only speak to the United States. And to Recompose, we charge $5,500 US, so $5,500 for the whole service, including an actual virtual service by family and friends right now, or with family and friends. And cremation, you can have in the US a very simple cremation for around $1,000, but the average is $6,000 in the US, mostly because people are also choosing an urn, a casket, and a service, or some combination of that.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And we don't know the costs as yet of liquid hydrolysis. Obviously, some of this kit is expensive, and then you're trying to get the returns on the investment. But there might be some interesting community and share models to push pioneering in the UK, and I'm very much hoping that will come through in various different ways. So panel, in about 5 minutes, I think we could probably just have any rounding off comments that you might have, anything else that you've been wanting to say that you haven't had the chance to say. But meanwhile, to our lovely and beautifully questioning audience, time for 1 or 2 more questions. John might be a biochemist, or he's certainly got interest in that direction. I'd love to know a bit more of the biochemistry of recomposition. The whole body is an anaerobic environment, and after death, the bacteria from the gut start to digest the body and generate methane, which initially leaves the anus and the mouth, and when the body putrefies, more will come out. Where does this methane go? Are the gases from the recomposition process analysed and measured? Katrina.
What a beautifully specific question. Thank you, John. Yeah, so, so for Recompose, when we brought this idea to the legislature in 2018, we first did a pilot project with Washington State University's Soil Science Department, because we knew that even though farmers had been safely doing this based on guidelines created by the Department of Ecology for decades, that if we didn't do a pilot with human bodies, it would be hard to convince the legislature that this was safe. So we were very honored to welcome 6 humans who donated their bodies to this pilot, and we composted their bodies in a very rigorous sort of environment, meaning the university, and tested for sort of the 3 big questions: pathogens, heavy metals, and pharmaceuticals. We were curious what happened to pharmaceuticals in a body that was composted. And we knew from livestock composting that pathogens were destroyed by the high heat, but we showed that again. We found that heavy metals were way below EPA limits. That's our regulatory body here. And then we were also surprised and pleased to see a reduction of pharmaceuticals, which is not the purpose of human composting, but is a really nice thing that we won't be adding pharmaceuticals into the waterway with our process. Now the regulations here in the US require operators to test every batch of compost that comes out to make sure that the pathogen levels are low and that heavy metals are low as well. And we submit those as reports on a monthly basis. I hope that it doesn't quite answer the methane question, but I think it gets at some of the safety question, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
How big is a batch of compost? I mean, that sounds quite rigorous, the testing.
We knew we didn't have a chance if we didn't really prove the safety. I mean, of course.
Yeah. So when you say every batch is tested, how is that a number of bodies, or is that done by weight, or how do you?
I should say every person's compost is tested. And as operators show that they're meeting the requirements, that tapers off, but there's a pretty large, I think in Washington, it's 80 instances of showing that you are meeting those requirements. Oh, and I should say, finally, so far in each state, we have regulations that require operators to show that the temperature threshold is being met, and that again is ensuring pathogen kill.
Thank you. Fiona, thanks for your question a little while ago about plants and shrubs, and I think that Katrina answered those. Derek, could we share a list of the different green burial methods, perhaps an article? Can I suggest that we try to circulate that afterwards? That is a very good question. And there will be that thing. Somebody, I don't think you've got this problem just yet, but a quick one for you, Katrina. If spaces in the composting facility are full, do you turn people away? Do you keep the bodies in a morgue? Do you discuss other options?
One of the amazing things that happened was when we opened with a very small 10 vessel facility in December, we immediately had a small wait list without much outreach and with no advertising formally. And so our service director works with families to make sure that they're comfortable with a short wait, sometimes up to a month. We try not to go longer than that in a cooled storage. But that's part of the reason we're building a larger facility, is because we're not meeting demand quite yet.
Wonderful. And I believe that on your website, you've got some of the scientific reports are publicly available. I've seen them, Katrina. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. So Rebecca was asking that. So go onto the website, and it's one of the joys of Katrina's work, as indeed Ken's, is the sort of transparency. It's a rigorous inquiry. They're not trying to take us on a journey that isn't well evidenced, and there's a lot of material that Katrina and her amazing colleagues have made available. So as we nudge towards 8 o'clock, as well as thanking everybody for the perspectives that you've given through your questions, thank you. I'm just going to invite our panelists to look into that future, that window, if you will, and what is it that in the next 10 years you would most dearly like to see? And do you have any tips or encouragement for all of us as we think about our own ending and perhaps help the movement that we're all part of? So looking to the future, and what can we bring to it? Ken, could I go to you first, please?
Yes, two things, I think. We've been telling people for decades that cremation is the way forward. We now have to dissuade people against that. So I want to see a carbon tax put on cremation. It needs to be red rated to show that these options we're talking about today are much better for the environment and better for everybody else. The second thing I would want is legislation to allow us to reuse graves. I can put people into graves virtually at the bottom of their gardens in some cemeteries, in say Croydon. And we actually did a natural burial in Croydon where everybody walked from their houses. There were no cars. And so if councils were doing that, those graves would be available at the cheapest possible cost. So we would be socially, an anti-poverty action as well. And I can assure everybody, the cemetery would quickly fill up with hedgehogs, owls, goodness knows what.
What's there not to like? It's good for humans, good for budgets, good for hedgehogs, and good for owls. Yeah, thank you, Ken. Sarah, could I go to you next? What about the next 10 years for Poppies? Where would you like things to get to?
Oh, there's so much. Speaking sort of for our wider sector, I would like to see all funeral directors and our entire bereavement sector taking full responsibility to signpost people to greener and more environmental choices, that this is not negotiable, that we all need to learn, we can all do better, us included. And we have a massive responsibility to inform people, to educate people and help people make better choices for the planet and for people. I feel very strongly that these discussions about death and dying, but also the environmental impact of death and dying, needs to be taught and spoken about in schools. I think this is a conversation we need to have with younger people at an earlier age, and to start demystifying what it means to die, what death is about, and particularly how young people can have a wonderful impact on the planet even when they're dead. A small thing, but I think a massive thing I would also love to see is the removal of plastic handles from coffins. I would love to see the same sort of innovation that we've seen in the food sector, where we have these amazing biodegradable, compostable packaging for foods. Surely there is some way of creating a brass effect handle to go on a coffin where people feel that that is the right coffin for them, that is made of cornstarch or pulp from a fig, something similar that creates that same effect and gives that same feeling, if that's important, but made from something that is not plastic. I'd like
that's a wonderful
everything.
Yeah, it's a wonderful practical example, because rope isn't for everybody, but what I'm saying is there's got to be something that is appropriate for everybody. It's a very good example. Just quickly from me, the corpsproject.net has findings from our work, including work with teenagers in a multi-tradition, multicultural inner city school in Birmingham, working with 14 and 15-year-olds, which was a wonderful part of the project. And finally, if I may come to you, Katrina, you've already taken the whole sector on quite a journey the last 10 years, and I know you've got some more energy. Where's the energy going to take you?
I think it's so amazing. I mean, speaking of energy, we see how excited people are about opening up this conversation about talking about composting their bodies, or not, but talking about it down the road. And similarly, I want to see green burial, natural burial continue to be elevated and talked about more. So I think this is part of it. We're doing the work right now. It's being talked about. And I think there's quite a change happening. So I'm really excited to be part of the journey and on for the ride.
Oh, well, we're glad that you're with us, and across the globe, so many people on the same wide movement, same wide journey. Don't forget, it's we're coming up to the season of the Day of the Dead, Mexican Day of the Dead, All Souls, All Saints, November in the UK. It gets darker and colder, and it's a fantastic time to go deep and get your roots down there. Talk to your friends over a glass in the evening. It's that season. And if there's one thing you can do is talk about the discussion we've had, take it further in small groups or in your business, and just keep that conversation going. So may I extend my warmest thanks to Poppies for convening us and for all the work that you do, for Katrina for your inspiration, Seattle and beyond, and Ken for your pioneering work over many decades and for the energy that you carry on bringing to this debate. And that concludes our webinar. I thank you very much for your attendance, and we wish you all a very good afternoon, morning, or evening. Bye-bye.